Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first witness today is Rachel Scarrabelotti. Please, could the witness be sworn?
I'd like to stand up, please. Hold the Bible and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down.
Please give your full name.
Rachel Scarrabelotti.
Ms. Scarrabelotti, you've provided 6 statements to the inquiry.
Yes.
The first 5 of which are corporate statements, which you've provided in your capacity as Company Secretary of Post Office Limited. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Your 6th statement to the inquiry, in your 6th statement, you've given responses to questions directed to you personally concerning matters which have arisen during your employment as Company Secretary. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
My questions for you today will be focused upon your 6th witness statement, but before we begin examining your evidence, there are some formalities we need to go through to confirm that the contents of your statements are all true and whether you wish to make any corrections. Is that clear?
Yes.
Thank you. I propose to deal with your statements in date order, which takes them slightly out of sequence. Could we begin, please, with your 2nd statement to the inquiry that's dated the 16th of February 2024? That statement bears the reference WITN 111-20200. Do you have a copy of that statement?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
It should run to 40 pages. Could I ask you please to turn to page 36? Do you see your signature there?
Yes, I do.
Is the content of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Turning then to what's described as your first statement, that one is dated the 20th of February, so post-dates your 2nd statement. And it bears the reference WITN 111-20100. Do you have a copy of that statement in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. That statement runs to 63 pages. Could I ask you please to turn to page 50?
Yes.
Do you see your signature there?
Yes.
Is the content of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Your 3rd statement then, please, bears the reference WITN 111-20300. It's dated the 13th of March 2024. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
That runs to 93 pages, but includes a lengthy exhibit. Could I ask you please to turn to page 15 of that statement?
Yes.
Do you see your signature there?
Yes, I do.
And is the content of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Your 4th statement, please, bears the reference WITN 111-20400. It's dated the 28th of March of this year and runs to 50 pages. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Could I ask you please to turn to page 33?
Yes.
Do you see your signature there?
Yes, I do.
Is the content of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Next, your 5th statement, please, dated the 19th of July 2024. It bears the reference WITN 111-20500. It's 3 pages in length, containing a correction to your 2nd witness statement. At page 3, please, do you see your signature?
Yes, I do.
And is the content of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Finally then, dealing with your 6th statement to the inquiry dated the 29th of August 2024. Have you got a copy of that statement in front?
Yes, I do.
That runs to 85 pages. Can I ask you please to turn to page 83?
Yes.
Do you see your signature there?
Yes, I do.
I understand there are some corrections that you wish to make in relation to this statement. Is that correct?
Yes, please.
So firstly, at paragraph 44, subparagraph C, on page 29. Do you have that before you?
Yes, I do.
At the end of the 2nd line, it reads, "This is an executive-level committee." So this is a reference to the Historical Remediation Unit.
Yes.
You describe it as an executive-level committee charged with operational responsibility for the delivery of remediation matters. Is it correct that it is in fact a business unit rather than an executive level committee?
Yes, that's right.
And therefore you would like to that to be amended to reflect the correct position?
That's right, yes.
Then at para 86, please, on page 56 of your statement. You date the review carried out by Ernst & Young of the Post Office's whistleblowing policies as the 1st of June 2023. Should that in fact read the 26th of April 2023?
That's right, yes.
Thank you. Finally, at paragraph 113 on page 68, you refer to the Post Office's group legal policy, which you say there has previously been disclosed to the inquiry. Is it in fact right that the policy had not been disclosed as at the date on which you signed your statement?
That's right, yes.
It has now been disclosed,
Yes.
And it bears the reference POL 00460567. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Subject to the corrections which you've just made, is the content of your sixth statement dated the 29th of August of this year true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. You are currently employed as the company secretary of Post Office Limited, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Before we examine your role as company secretary, I want to ask you some brief questions about your background, please.
Sure.
You studied law and were later admitted as a barrister to the Supreme Court of Queensland, the Federal Court of Australia, and the High Court of Australia in 2002. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
The following year, you were admitted as a solicitor to the Supreme Court of Queensland and the Australian Capital Territory. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
You spent your early legal career working in corporate real estate and real estate investment management in both Brisbane, Australia, and in London. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
In 2011, you were appointed senior legal counsel and company secretary in the investment arm of the construction and real estate business conducted by Lend-Lease. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
You transferred to the company's London office in early 2018 to become legal counsel and company secretary for the Europe, Middle East and Africa region. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
In that role, you oversaw the corporate governance arrangements of approximately 260 subsidiary companies. Is that right?
Yes.
And you later qualified as a Chartered Secretary and Governance Professional with the Chartered Governance Institute UK and Ireland in 2022.
That's right, yes.
Was that before or after you joined the Post Office as Company Secretary?
That was before.
So turning then to your role as Company Secretary of Post Office,
Yes.
you joined the Post Office in March 2022, is that correct?
That's right, yes.
But you weren't formally admitted or appointed into the role of Company Secretary until April, is that right?
That's right, yes.
You explain in your statement that part of your role as Company Secretary is to provide independent advice to the board on corporate governance matters, is that right?
That's right, yes.
In your role as Company Secretary, you report to the General Counsel of the Post Office, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Do you think that reporting to the General Counsel affects your ability to provide independent advice to the Post Office Board?
No.
And why is that?
I suppose whilst my reporting line is through to the General Counsel, I am ultimately accountable to the Chair and to the Board. So I don't feel that my independence is at all compromised by virtue of my reporting line.
Thank you. Could I ask you please just to speak a little louder?
Sure, yep.
I think, like me, quite softly spoken, but in between. I understand if you sit
Or
in between them,
Yeah, sure.
that's meant to be optimal.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you some questions now about your training and induction into the role of Company Secretary. In your statement, you explained you had a handover meeting with your predecessor
Yes,
and that she supplied you with some handover notes. Is that right?
that's right, yes.
Is it right that you did not take part in any formal induction programme and you were not provided with any specific induction materials?
Yes, so certainly nothing specific.
You undertook some general training applicable to all new entrants. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
As well as a series of training courses addressing a range of topics such as money laundering, data protection, bribery and whistleblowing. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
What was your perception at the time you joined as to the adequacy of your training and induction?
It was very minimal, what I received, and it did make it more difficult to get to grips with my role in good time. It made it harder to do the role.
Forgive me. Can you elaborate a little? In what sense did it make it more difficult for you?
Well, I think as company secretary, you need a deep understanding of the key issues that are facing the company. And I think if you're briefed very specifically on those issues, then that helps you to navigate those, with greater ease.
So is it the case that you ended up learning on your feet?
Yes, very much.
Of these issues in the role?
Yes.
That you've taken on? Did you raise any concerns at the time about the quality and scope of the training and induction which you'd received?
No.
What changes do you think need to be made to improve that situation?
I think for anyone coming into the company secretarial team or the executive team or the company generally, I think that they need to be briefed very specifically on the main issues that are of relevance, to the company.
And what do you, in your role now, what do you consider to be the main issues affecting the company?
Well, it's probably all of the issues that go to our core priorities. So our core priorities are transforming technology, rebuilding trust, and improving branch technology. So I think if people understand the different issues sitting behind each of those priorities and how they can align their efforts with those priorities, I think that would be very insightful.
Forgive me, I think there's still some difficulty in hearing your...
Sorry, I'll try to be... Sorry, pardon me. Yeah.
Thank you. In your role as company secretary, you receive requests for matters to be raised with and or discussed at meetings of the board. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
You then decide first whether the matter is sufficiently important to warrant being considered by the board. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And secondly, if the matter does justify the board's time, whether it should be dealt with by way of an oral presentation or simply as a noting paper. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Can you please describe the criteria you use to determine which matters go to the board and which should be decided in other groups or committees?
Well, it's probably looking at the matters reserved for the board document, which demarcates very clearly where different items need to come to the board for decision, and then it sets out which matters are delegated to subsidiary boards or which matters are delegated to committees of the board, and then it also sets out which matters are delegated to the executive. So I'll probably use that as my starting point.
And from there?
From there, I guess if there's that there can be matters where it's less clear. For example, where the financial delegation to the executive, a matter could be within that, but because of the risk profile associated with the item, it would still be something that you would want to come to board. So it's looking at it through that additional lens as well.
In your statement, you characterise your approach in this way. You say, while I am required to exercise a degree of judgment in relation to the strategic importance of potential matters when initially deciding on their inclusion, I generally adopt an over-inclusive approach and err on the side of caution. Is that right?
Yes.
One of the issues you identify in your statement concerning the governance of the Post Office relates to the length of the board papers and their focus on operational matters. Is that right?
Yes.
What do you consider to be the underlying cause or causes of that issue?
Sorry, that the board papers are...
Their length and their focus on operational matters.
I think that people can treat the board sometimes as a confessional. So thinking that if they bring all the information that they have to board and tell the board everything, that it will somehow alleviate them of their responsibility.
What are the consequences, do you think, from a governance perspective of the board being overburdened with the detail of operational matters?
I think that it blurs lines of accountability. I think that respect perhaps is lost for the board because they're associated with operational matters which are for the executive. And that the board ultimately doesn't get to fulfil their proper function and be the board.
Do you think that your own approach of being over-inclusive in relation to the board agenda items might be contributing to that problem?
Possibly, but I would say that we do go through an exercise with it was the CEO, now it's the acting CEO and the Chief of Staff, where we do look to whittle down the first agenda that the draft agenda that I prepare. And, we need to make some tough decisions about what actually does go to the board. And, matters too can be deferred to later agendas. But I don't think it does contribute.
You've described there a process of consultation.
Yes.
With some of the senior executives of the company. Does it follow that decisions as to precisely what goes to the board doesn't rest solely on your shoulders?
That's right. So as I say, the acting CEO and the Chief of Staff will have a look initially at the proposed draft agenda. They will have insights as to what's happening in the business and whether or not certain matters are actually ready to come. So there'll be some reduction to the agenda through that process. And the draft agenda also goes to the strategic executive group, who will given an opportunity to comment, to feed in, and their comments are taken on board. So it's certainly not just me devising the agenda, and then ultimately I send the agenda to the chair as well. And the chair themselves needs to be happy and content with what's proposed, or perhaps it's just content with what is proposed to come to the board.
Thank you. What, if any, changes have been implemented to address the problem you've described about the length of board papers and their focus on operational matters?
So since the interim chair joined, we've brought in new restrictions on paper length to try to ensure that papers are more strategically focused, so they're more pithy, more punchy, and so paper authors, you don't have a lot of opportunity, I guess. You've got to get in there in the paper, pretty quick, smart, advise, what you want, why you want it, and get out. So I think that's helping, having a more restricted paper length. That's probably one of the main changes.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a new topic, please, concerning your knowledge of the Horizon IT system.
Yes.
Prior to joining the Post Office, you had some awareness, you say, of the issues relating to Horizon from information reported in the media. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Since you joined the Post Office in March 2020, you say you've completed a short training session relating to the outcome of the group litigation. Is that
yes.
right? And you've also reviewed materials submitted to the board and executive meetings relating to Horizon and in particular the programme to replace it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
In your statement, you say that you've developed some understanding of the Horizon IT system from reading those materials. Is that correct?
Yes.
Please, could we take a brief look at what you say on this topic at paragraph 8 of your statement. So this is statement number 6, WITN 11120 at page 4, please. Thank you. So if we could scroll down, please, to paragraph 8. Thank you. So 4 lines down, forgive me, 5 lines down, you say this: from the materials I've reviewed, my understanding is that whilst there have been different versions of Horizon provided since it was first introduced, the Horizon IT system is considered to be aged and difficult to update in the case of new products. Just pausing there, from where within the Post Office do you understand this information about Horizon to originate?
Sort of in relation to it being aged and difficult to update, well, probably from the IT function, yeah.
What have you gleaned from reading the materials submitted to the board and the Strategic Executive Group about the reliability of the current version of Horizon?
I understand that it is thought to be reasonably reliable.
You go on to say in your statement, I have also attended employee sessions introducing MBIT, which have highlighted to me the more labour-intensive nature of the Horizon IT system for postmasters, for example, in terms of the training required and transaction times, along with difficulties for postmasters in extracting transaction data from Horizon. The inquiry has heard evidence about the significant challenges which have beset the new branch IT programme. What is your view as Company Secretary as to the adequacy of reporting to the board on the problems which have been experienced with that programme?
So I understand that the problems are in relation to delays, problems in relation to costs, and then also problems in relation to the numbers of defects, so bugs, errors, defects in the system. So sort of as pretty much a standing agenda item, pretty much since I joined Post Office, on the board agenda would be an update on the progress of the NBIT SPM program. So, I mean, it's very difficult to say. I mean, you know, we sort of rely very much on the executive to be bringing forward, you know, program reports. But the board, yeah, absolutely has been periodically, regularly updated on the program by the executive.
Do you consider that the updates the board has received have been both accurate and timely in relation to those problems which you've described?
I don't think so, to be honest.
In your statement, you describe the many initiatives. So I'm going to move on, please, to the cultural attitudes within the Post Office to postmasters. In your statement, you describe the many initiatives which have been launched to bring about cultural change within the Post Office.
Yes.
These include the establishment of an improvement delivery group.
Yes.
The creation of an ethos programme.
Yes.
The establishment of a dedicated committee and unit to deal with remediation issues.
Yes.
And the creation of a new postmaster director role within the executive team of the Post Office.
That's right, yes.
There are more, but those perhaps some of the major initiatives that have been undertaken. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
Would it be fair to say that you don't believe these initiatives have been entirely successful in bringing about cultural change, the cultural change which is needed within the Post Office?
Yes, I think that's fair.
You identify in your statement a number of factors which you believe have impeded the progress of cultural change. I wonder if we could look, please, at paragraph 50 of your statement, where you set out some of these factors. That's at page 37, please. So one of the first factors you identify is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the result this had, initially requiring individuals to work from home and subsequently the less frequent attendance in the office. Is that correct?
Yes.
Secondly, you refer here to the large number of fixed-term contract employees within the Post Office working both within the remediation unit and in the delivery of the MBIT programme.
Yes.
And finally, you say this, please. So this is 4 lines up from the bottom. You say another consideration is whether the above activities to drive cultural change have been as effective as possible, particularly having regard to the long tenure of some Post Office employees who may have held certain views for an extended period of time. I'd like to ask you some questions about that final comment, please. The inquiry has heard evidence from 2 postmaster non-executive directors that there's a prevailing attitude within the Post Office that postmasters are guilty and on the take. Are those the types of views to which you are referring here?
Yes, I think my point there was just to say that, where there have been employees who have served in the business perhaps for a number of years and, were previously part of, the Royal Mail Group, joined Post Office, have remained with Post Office post-separation, that perhaps culturally they're in a different place to others at Post Office.
What exactly do you mean when you say that they're in a different place?
In terms of their attitudes towards postmasters.
As to their guilt?
I think as to their honesty, yes.
As to their honesty and their integrity?
Yes.
Do you consider that these views remain prevalent within a particular area of the business or are widespread across the Post Office?
I don't think that they're widespread or prevalent, but I think my point here was just to say, given the long-serving tenure of certain employees, that it can be difficult to achieve cultural change in those circumstances.
You've referred in your statement to an engagement survey which was undertaken with Post Office employees earlier this year.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you about one of the themes which emerged from that survey, please.
Sure.
That document bears the reference POL 00446681. Could that please be shown on the screen? Thank you. If we could turn, please, to the second page, we can see there a high-level summary of the themes which emerged from the responses to that survey. Under number 3, please, it reads, poor communication is driving a lack of confidence in Post Office and senior management from other colleagues. This is directly impacting their sense of pride and belief in Post Office. This appears to be exacerbated at present because Post Office's communications are driven and controlled by the external narrative. What do you understand, please, by that final reference to the Post Office's communications being driven and controlled by an external narrative?
I think the point there is that there's been a few unfortunate incidents where the media has reported on different circumstances arising at post office, and the reporting has taken place ahead of employee colleagues being advised. So I think that does make it very, very difficult.
Is the phrase external narrative one which is, to your knowledge, widely used within the post office? Is it something with which you're familiar as a term?
No, I don't, not particularly familiar with that phrase.
Could it be referring, do you think, to the external pressure to exonerate and compensate postmasters who were held liable for shortfalls shown by Horizon?
Possibly.
Does this theme demonstrate, do you think, that there are many within the post office who disagree with that narrative, that to say that pressure to exonerate and compensate postmasters?
I don't think that that's true.
One of the issues on which the inquiry has heard evidence already in this phase concerns the suitability of certain post office employees to hold roles within the remediation unit due to their historic involvement, for example, in the conduct of audits and investigations. Were you aware of the concerns expressed by the postmaster non-executive directors earlier this year about the progress being made to address the potential conflicts of interest within that unit?
Yes.
Do you consider that the senior executive team has given that issue sufficient prominence and priority in light of the ongoing cultural problems which exist within the organisation?
I think in recent times they have, yes.
And by recent times, you mean?
Probably over the course of this year.
From a governance perspective, do you consider that this is an issue on which the board of the Post Office should have greater oversight and input than it currently does?
I think that they've had a reasonable amount of oversight. The matter Past Roles Review Project Phoenix has come to the board absolutely periodically. I think the board are probably due for another comprehensive update sort of around this time.
Forgive me, the board is due an update?
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a new topic, please, concerning the culture and composition of the Post Office Board.
Yes.
And the senior executive team. You've explained in your statement that it's difficult to identify a discernible culture within the Post Office Board due to the high turnover of directors in recent years. Is that right?
That's right.
One concern you raise in your statement relates to the diversity of board members.
Yes.
In what respects do you consider the diversity of the Post Office Board could be improved?
Well, definitely gender diversity. So currently we have 2 female directors, which is sort of, tracking sort of well below, sort of generally accepted percentages for, the composition of boards as to gender. I think in terms of ethnic diversity as well, we could improve there. The board should, be reflective of our main stakeholders. So customers, postmasters. Possibly we could have greater diversity of age as well.
In his evidence to the inquiry, Mr. Staunton, the former chair of the Post Office Board, expressed his concern about the retention of talented women in senior roles within the Post Office. Is that a concern which you share?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question was that, the statement was this initially. In his evidence to the inquiry, Mr. Staunton, the former chair of the Post Office, expressed some concern about the retention of talented women in senior roles within the Post Office. My question to you is that a concern which you share?
Yes, it is.
And why is that?
I suppose at board level, So unfortunately, we had our 3 female directors all leave in reasonably quick succession in 2023. And on the senior executive group, unfortunately, we had only 1 female member for quite a long period. That was the CPO. And currently, the strategic executive group is better balanced by way of gender, but it is absolutely a concern having gender diversity in those top forums.
What do you understand to be the underlying causes of the problem in retaining talented women in senior roles?
At the post office?
At the post office.
Post office, it's not an easy place to work. It's very, very stressful. I suppose at the strategic executive group level, previously walking into a room full of men, that can be very intimidating. But I think it's just the general pressures of working at post office. That's not attractive.
In your statement, you say that the decision to appoint 2 postmaster non-executive directors was part of an effort to build a culture of inclusion for postmasters at the post office board level.
Yes.
Is that correct? You acknowledge that this change has brought certain benefits to the board, including a greater insight into the issues and concerns affecting postmasters. Is that right?
Yes.
Would it nonetheless be fair to say it's brought some challenges as well from a governance perspective?
Yes, I think that's fair.
What do you consider those challenges to be?
Probably navigating through conflicts of interest for the postmaster directors, because obviously being postmasters, we have to be very careful of personal conflict matters. I think we've had issues in terms of the postmaster directors are incredible with their operational knowledge and their know-how, their ability is amazing, but the board is not charged with responsibility for day-to-day operational matters. That's with the executive. So we have to be very careful that the board doesn't stray into matters for the executive.
On the, forgive me, you referred to conflicts of interest. I think in your statement you described this as a lack of alignment between the needs and desires of, a potential lack of alignment between the needs and desires of postmasters and the wider interests of the business and its shareholders. Is that fair? Or would you say that's yet another issue?
Yes,
a separate issue.
I think what I was trying to get at there was, directors' duties. So obviously the postmaster non-executive directors, as directors of the company, are subject to the same duties as all of the other directors, which is to, act in the best interests of the company, having regard to a number of different matters, including, stakeholders, but ultimately acting for the benefit of the shareholder. So to me that seems, it doesn't necessarily align always with what is in the best interests of postmasters.
And where specifically do you see the areas of conflict?
Is it conflict or non-alignment?
Or lack of alignment?
Lack of alignment. Well, I suppose, if we just go to, a basic issue such as postmaster remuneration, the company is cash constrained. Directors, unfortunately, have had to consider wrongful trading issues, very recently, and make some very, very tough decisions around how our finite funds are spent. So, whilst I think, everyone would love to improve postmaster remuneration, at the same time, the board are thinking of, wrongful trading issues. So it's marrying up, keeping the company alive and floating, as against, sort of the stark reality of postmasters, remuneration remaining, very flat.
You've suggested in your statement that there might be better ways in which to bring the voice of postmasters into the post office. Is that fair?
Yes.
One of the options which you mention is the appointment of more postmaster representatives within the executive team of the post office.
Yes.
What do you consider to be the advantages of that approach?
Well, I think it's as I mentioned before. I mean, our postmaster non-executive directors have demonstrated their operational expertise. The executive is charged with day-to-day responsibility for operational matters. So, to my mind, it's a matter of harnessing the best knowledge that the postmasters have and incorporating them within the most, perhaps the forum where they can achieve the most, which would be, potentially by having more postmasters at the executive level.
Another possibility, which you mentioned in your statement, is the mutualisation of the post office.
Yes.
What do you consider to be the potential advantages of adopting that approach to ownership and governance of the company?
Okay. I'm not an expert in mutuals or cooperatives, but to my mind, the benefit would be that the ultimate shareholding would be with postmasters and potentially employees of the company. So when directors are fulfilling their duties and acting in the best interests of the company, but for the benefit of the shareholder, that shareholder would be postmasters.
Is there potential, do you think, for a lack of alignment between the interests of postmasters and post office employees, assuming that ownership is shared between those two different groups?
Potentially, but my experience of working at post office is that the people who have joined, particularly recently, are very much attracted and choose very, very specifically to come work for the post office, because they believe in the post office as the institution of the post office. So they're very, very particularly attracted to work for the company for that reason.
And does it follow that they, in your view, have a more positive attitude towards postmasters?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you some questions now about the internal investigation into one of the postmaster non-executive directors, Mr. Jacobs.
Yes.
When did you first become aware that an internal investigation was being launched into Mr. Jacobs' branch accounting?
I think it was in September 22.
Who brought the matter to your attention?
Nick Reed.
What was your reaction on being told that a member of the Post Office Board was being investigated for apparent shortfalls in his branch accounts?
I was concerned.
Why is that?
Well, I was concerned from probably a company secretarial perspective, thinking through to our annual report and accounts and different potential disclosures that might need to be made. I was thinking of different board meetings where branch discrepancies and the approach to those had been discussed, and whether or not there was a conflict point there that had been missed potentially. And I was concerned for Elliot as well.
What action did you take when you were notified that an investigation into Mr. Jacobs had commenced?
My first action after Mr. Reid told me about the issue was to let my line manager know, our current general counsel, and my proposal was to check some of the data points that I had available to me to see if they could put any illumination, onto the issue. The General Counsel advised me that Mr. Reid should, should look to transfer this matter potentially into an investigation, and that's then what happened.
Just in terms then, sorry, just to explore with you then the reporting of this issue.
Yes.
You say that the CEO, Mr. Reid, reported the matter to you, and that you reported it on to General Counsel, Mr. Fote.
That's right, yes.
Why is it, do you know, that the matter came first to Mr. Reid as CEO rather than Mr. Fote as General Counsel, who had overall oversight and responsibility for internal investigations?
Well, I guess an issue of this sort, I don't think that it would be unusual for it to be notified to the CEO.
So you brought it to the attention of Mr. Fote?
Yes, I did.
And it was his direction, was it, that an internal investigation be launched?
That was his suggestion as to the approach, yes.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt? I'm not sure I've got this straight. When Mr. Reid notified you that, I'll use the neutral word, something was happening in relation to Mr. Elliott, was there, by that time, in your view, a formal investigation occurring, or was it simply that people in the investigation department were in discussion with Mr. Elliott?
So at the time that Mr. Reid spoke to me, I understand that there was no investigation going on, and that the investigations unit had not been advised at that time.
So Mr. Reid was effectively notifying you that obviously someone must have alerted him, to the possibility of an investigation. Is that a fair way of putting it? What I can't quite grasp at the moment is what was said to Mr. Reid. Now, I appreciate you don't know that, but from your understanding, what was it that Mr. Reid was communicating to you?
Mr. Reid was communicating to me that there was a potential issue.
Right. And someone must have told him that.
Yes.
He wouldn't know that without, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So what I'm trying to get to the bottom of, was this coming to Mr. Reid, so far as you can tell, from some kind of, not formal investigation, but something that the investigating department had been doing, or was it unrelated to the investigating department?
Yes, my understanding it was unrelated to the investigating department.
All right, okay. Fine, sorry. And so then the steps occurred as you described, Mr. Reid to you, you to Mr. Fote, and Mr. Fote deciding there'd better be an investigation.
Yes, that's right, sir.
Yeah, all right, fine.
Thank you. I wonder if we could pull up, please, an email which you wrote to the then chair, Mr. Staunton, in late February 2023. It's POL 0044 8679, please. Thank you. If we scroll down, please, to the top of page 2. Thank you. We can see there an email you've addressed to Mr. Staunton on the 28th of February 2023, copying in Mr. Reid, Mr. Fote, Mr. Patel, and Mr. Tidswell. The subject matter being the postmaster non-executive director matter. Oh, forgive me. That's the bottom of page 1. Can we go down to the top of page 2, please? Thank you. So what we saw just there was Mr. Staunton's response. This is your email of the same date, 28th of February, addressed to Mr. Staunton, Mr. Reid, Mr. Vogt, Mr. Patel, and Mr. Tiswell. It reads, "Hi Henry, I hope you've arrived back safe and sound. I understand you've been advised previously of the investigation into apparent shortfalls in branches held by Elliot Jacobs. By way of reminder, and then you provide a brief overview of the investigation. So it reads, Mr. Elliot owns a business, Universal Office Equipment, which runs 7 premises containing post offices. Since early 2019, UOE has accumulated shortfalls in the operation of its post office business. Prior to Mr. Jacobs becoming a non-executive director, he repaid some of the shortfall, but since becoming a director, he has not engaged with the repayment process nor challenged the shortfalls. Each month, the post office team responsible for recovering agreed shortfalls has sent Mr. Jacobs a statement showing the outstanding amount. Training has been offered but not taken up. The uncontested shortfall now sits around £213,000. I'm just pausing there. Given that shortfalls had reportedly been accumulating since early 2019, what do you understand to have been the trigger for the reporting of this issue, that is to say, a shortfall in his accounts to Mr. Reid?
I think perhaps it was that repayment had been made previously. However, it had stopped, and it had stopped following the time when Elliot joined the board. So I think perhaps it was that then prompted Mr. Reid being advised, and I think it was that, concerns that Elliot was not engaging with the support centre in respect of the alleged shortfalls.
Was there a concern, do you think, that Mr. Jacobs was abusing his position as a director to avoid making repayments of accounting shortfalls?
I don't know.
The email goes on to say, Mr. Jacobs is in the process of seeking to take on a further 2 post office premises. It then says CIU, that's a reference to the Central Investigations Unit, is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Is investigating under Project Venus, firstly, whether Mr. Jacobs should have declared his shortfalls in the process of becoming a director. Secondly, the extent of the shortfalls. And thirdly, whether Mr. Jacobs declared a conflict during board meetings where recoveries from postmasters were discussed. So that latter one being a concern which you've addressed already in your evidence today, the potential for a conflict to have arisen and not been declared.
Yes.
The final bullet point reads, branch assurance are to visit all 7 of Mr. Jacobs' locations to settle a full cash and stock position in mid-April 2023. That suggests, does it not, that no audit had yet been undertaken of Mr. Elliott's 7 branches?
Yes, I think that's right.
It must follow, does it not, that the estimated figure of £213,000 had therefore been based upon the data shown on Horizon. Is that consistent with your understanding?
I mean, I'm not sure how that figure was built up.
Did you give any thought at the time as to whether it was appropriate for the Post Office to launch a formal investigation into one of its board members based on accounting data shown by Horizon?
I mean, I think it was very difficult, but I think the board were very concerned to ensure that, the postmaster policies were applied equally to our postmaster non-executive directors. So could you repeat the question again?
Yes, sorry. My question was whether you gave any thought at the time as to whether it was appropriate for the Post Office to launch an investigation into one of its board members based, and this is an assumption, but assuming it was based solely on evidence on data shown on Horizon, rather than an actual audit itself of the branch accounts.
I don't think I can say.
The email goes on to say this, Nick Reed, Ben Fote and I would like to see you tomorrow if possible to request that you consider meeting with Elliot to discuss this matter, particularly ahead of the next board meeting. In terms of your meeting with Elliot, we suggest the following points are covered. You go on to identify their potential areas of conflict arising from this outstanding shortfall and the board's treatment of recoveries, of accounting shortfalls. And you make a number of proposals to Mr. Staunton as how to manage those conflicts. If we could scroll down, please, to the top of page 3. Thank you. We see a further list of bullet points, and it's here that you explain really how the process is going to proceed. You say this, as with other shortfall matters, branch assurance visits will take place, scheduled for April, to determine a stock and cash position. After that, the team will then seek to discuss with Mr. Jacobs this position. Once the investigation presumably is completed, it should say, the chair and Mr. Jacobs can discuss a way forward. You say this, it would be a positive step for Mr. Jacobs to engage with the postmaster account support team. Can you explain what the role and function of that team is, please?
So I think that team is responsible for liaising with postmasters where there are branch discrepancies reported.
And when you say liaising, it's described as a support team. What's the nature of their role and function in that process?
I think it's to work through, whatever the issue is. So if there is an alleged, shortfall, to work with them to break it down, to understand, the nature of the shortfall, to test it, and to, try to determine if there was, actually a shortfall.
So would it be right to say that the role of that team is part of the investigative function? It's not there to provide what might be thought of as some form of support to the postmaster, pastoral or otherwise, in the investigation?
They're not. My understanding is that team is not part of the investigative unit.
So what role then does it play in the investigation? What you've described is it's there to get to look into and get to the bottom of the cause of the discrepancy.
Yes.
Is that on behalf of the postmaster rather than on behalf of the post office?
I think it's both.
Your email goes on to say it would be really helpful to have Mr. Jacobs' view as to why the shortfalls have spiked recently, either now if he has a view and freely offers it, or during the investigative meeting post-branch visits. You say, if Elliot asks about the post-branch visit investigative meeting, the CIU team will write to Elliot in advance, explaining what they propose to discuss, what the purpose is, and to advise that he can bring a friend to that meeting, or an NFSP rep, or even a legal rep if he would like. It's not an under caution interview, and we are not conducting a criminal investigation. We are looking to understand why these shortfalls occurred and what can be done to rectify the position in terms of understanding and perhaps provision of training to his staff. If we scroll back up to the top of the document, please. Thank you. We can see that there was a plan for you, Mr. Reed and Mr. Fote, to meet with Mr. Staunton the following day.
Yes.
Did that meeting take place?
Yes, it did.
How did Mr. Staunton react when you told him that Mr. Elliot was being investigated for accounting shortfalls?
I think he was concerned, but I think he was also, I wouldn't say relaxed, but he appreciated that a process would be gone through.
Did Mr. Staunton ask you for any advice about the propriety of the Post Office carrying out such an investigation into one of its board members?
No.
Did you offer any advice or support to Mr. Jacobs in your capacity as Company Secretary?
I don't recall that I did, no.
Do you think that you should have?
Potentially, yes.
The inquiry has heard evidence from Mr. Jacobs about the considerable distress which this investigation caused him.
Yes.
Did you listen to Mr. Jacobs' evidence to the inquiry last week?
Yes, I did.
You offer some reflections in your statement as to what might have gone wrong in the conduct of this particular investigation.
Yes.
Can we take a brief look at what you say, please, at paragraph 118 of your statement? On page 71. That's your sixth statement, please, WITN 111206000. Thank you. So you say this, in hindsight, while it was certainly important to ensure that there was no appearance of bias or special treatment, in my view, perhaps further thought could have been given as to whether sufficient support was extended to Mr. Jacobs during the investigation process. Who, in your view, was responsible for ensuring that Mr. Jacobs was suitably supported through that process?
Probably, as we've just said, probably myself. Perhaps the senior independent director as well.
You go on to say this. So forgive me, you say first, this is especially given the events that have occurred in the Post Office's recent past regarding its investigation processes. You then say, moreover, the fact that Mr. Jacobs did not necessarily come from a professional services background and therefore may not have had the same degree of experience as other Post Office board members in dealing with some of the matters which I understand were raised during the investigation could also have been taken into consideration. You make reference there to some of the matters that were raised during the investigation. What specifically are you referring to here, please?
So referring to the allegations that I understand were put to Elliot in respect of failure to declare a conflict at the board meetings where branch discrepancies were being, and the approach to branch discrepancies were being considered by the board. And the other allegation that Mr. Jacobs, Elliot, hadn't properly completed a director's emoluments form.
Why do you think his experience might have been different had he had a professional services background, as you say?
Well, something like a director's emoluments form, if you're a portfolio director or you're a senior lawyer or a senior accountant, you would probably approach that form on a very different knowledge basis as opposed to, to Elliot, so, a businessman, a retailer, an entrepreneur.
In your statement, you suggest this may be a learning issue in terms of the quality of the induction and training that Mr. Elliot received upon his appointment. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
Do you think there's any merit in the suggestion that the CIU was heavy-handed in its conduct and handling of this investigation?
I mean, I'm not sure, to be honest, but given the reflections that Elliot shared with board, he had found it a very, very unpleasant experience.
Thank you, sir. That brings me to the end of that topic. rather than launching into my next topic, which is likely to take a bit longer, I wonder if now would be a convenient time to take our morning break.
It would be, but can I just ask one or two further questions about this issue? When he gave evidence, if my recollection is correct, Mr. Elliott was obviously upset about the process involving the I'll call it an interview. There's some debate about how it was to be described, but the interview which took place between the investigators and himself. All right.
Yes.
But he also went on to say that following that interview, he then dealt with a different team, and the whole issue was dealt much more as a business issue, as opposed to an investigation issue, all right? And am I right in thinking that if we go back to the email that you wrote, that the unit, I've forgotten the name, sorry, without the email in front of me, but Mr. Elliott did begin to engage, however it came about, not with investigators, but with the branch support people that you had mentioned in your email. Have I got that right?
Yes, I think Mr. Elliott had engaged initially with the branch support people, sir.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'm giving you that by way of background. I wanted to ask you simply: do you know why Mr. Fote thought it appropriate to? Oh, it's up now. Next page, I think. No, never mind. Forget that. Do you know why Mr. Fote thought it appropriate to have an investigation as opposed to treating it, as Mr. Elliott thought was appropriate, as a business issue to be discussed? And I'm not here talking about the conflict part of this. I'm talking about the apparent shortfall part of this, all right?
No, so I'm not sure as to why this was tipped into being an investigation as opposed to being dealt with by, with the branch support team, for example.
That's between Mr. Fote and yourself. It was simply you reporting Mr. Reed's report to you, and Mr. Fote himself deciding it should be an investigation.
Yes.
Right, thanks. Now we can have our break. Ms. Hodge, what time should we start again?
Thank you, sir. Try to take the time. If we perhaps resume at 25 past, please.
Fine.
Good morning, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to move on, Ms. Scarrabelotti, to a new topic, please, concerning the board's oversight of the Post Office's policy of passing information to the police to assist in the conduct of criminal investigations and any subsequent prosecutions. What were you told upon joining the Post Office in March 2022 about the company's approach to the conduct of criminal investigations and prosecutions?
In respect of prosecutions, that the company was and had not for a number of years carried out any prosecutions. And in relation to the conduct of criminal investigations, I understand at the time that I joined the Central Investigations Unit was being sort of recruited for and brought together to set up a new business unit internally to deal with investigations.
Do you recall when it was first proposed that a change be made to the company's policy governing the provision of evidence to the police in the support of a criminal investigation?
I think this was in October October 2023 when a paper came to the board, and I think the paper was more sounding out the potential views of the board in relation to making, changes to the policy, specifically in relation to how evidence could be passed to the police.
Could we please take a brief look at the minutes of that meeting of the Post Office Board, dated the 31st of October 2023? They bear the reference POL 00458017. Thank you. So the relevant item is at number 9 on page 15, please. Thank you. So item 9.1 bears the title Disclosure of Evidence to Support Police Investigations. It makes reference to 3 documents that were tabled and noted at the meeting. Firstly, a request for evidence released to Police Scotland and discussion of broader policy change. That's the title of the report. And then 2 appendices. One, a draft of a witness statement for Police Scotland, and secondly, a summary of the Portree case. As you can see, the details of the board discussion have been redacted, so too have the relevant documents in the board pack, which has been disclosed to the inquiry. Without going into the details or the specifics of that particular case, can you please explain the background to the inclusion of this agenda item, so far as you recall?
Yes, so I think that there were 2 matters brought before the board. So the first one, which we've sort of spoken about just briefly, being proposed changes, or not proposed changes, but to understand the attitude of the board in relation to potential changes to the policy, specifically which would alter the way in which and the decision making for providing evidence to the police. And then the second aspect of the matter was seeking approval from the board in order to be able to share evidence with the police. So that would be, operating in line with the current, policy and the approval required in order to pass evidence to the police.
Can you assist, as best you recollect, as to what the nature of the proposed change was at this stage in October 2023?
Yes, so the proposal was that the decision-making in relation to the passing of evidence to the police would no longer sit with the board, as was currently set out in the policy, and that the decision-making for that, I understand, would sit with the Director for the Central Investigations Unit.
And you've indicated that what occurred at this meeting was a sounding out of the board as to their views on that proposed change. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Do you recall whether at this meeting the members of the board were in agreement with the proposal to delegate responsibility for that decision making?
They were not.
They were not. The subject was raised again at a meeting of the board in June 2024. Is that correct?
Yes.
Please can the minutes of the board meeting on the 4th of June be shown on the screen? Those are POL 00448648, please. Thank you. So these are the minutes of the 4th of June. If we could please turn to the middle of the second page, we can see item 2 on the agenda, which bears the heading Minutes and Matters Arising. Under Matters Arising, it states that the board noted the action log and status of the actions shown. And there at the second bullet point, in respect of items which have been proposed for closure, it states that key discussion points were as follows. So the second bullet point, please. Mr. Ismail questioned whether item 3 ought to be closed. Mr. Jacobs shared his view that if the company was proposing to provide evidence to support police investigations, then this should come to the board first. So just pausing there, who had proposed the closure of this item?
So I think it would have been the director of what is now called A&CI, so Assurance and Complex Investigations, which was previously known as the CIU.
What were the reasons, do you know, for proposing that this matter be closed at this stage?
I think it was proposed to be closed on the basis of the expectation that it would be brought to the next periodic scheduled board meeting, which was in the diary for the 8th of July.
What did you understand the nature of Mr. Ishmael's concerns to be about the proposal to close down this agenda item?
Well, that it was proposed to be closed, but the original action item that had arisen in the board meeting from the 23rd of October 23, as far as the board knew, that original action had not been attended to. So, why was it proposed then to close it?
Forgive me, what specifically was the action which had been raised at the end of the last board meeting in relation to this agenda item?
Yeah, so the board had asked in relation to the policy that there would be some simulation testing, I suppose, for lack of a more appropriate group of words, where postmasters would be taken through the policy and the proposed changes, and to have those changes, bounced off postmasters to see their, their response, and that there would be, just sort of basic testing for tonality, before the policy came back to the board.
So the board had requested that a consultation exercise be undertaken, in effect, with postmasters on the proposed changes. Is that?
Yes, I think so. They wanted postmaster input on the policy, and collaboration with postmasters on the policy.
That action, to your knowledge, hadn't been undertaken, is that right?
That's right, that's to my knowledge, yes.
And the proposal was to close down that particular action without further input and oversight from the board, is that right?
Well, to close the action on the basis that the matter was due to come to the next periodic board meeting.
So the intention being that the executive team would report again to the board on that particular action, but at the next meeting in July?
That's right, yes.
Do you know whether the consultation which the board asked to be undertaken, was that ever carried out?
Not to my knowledge.
So we can see Mr. Ishmael questioning whether the item ought to be closed. His views are shared by Mr. Jacobs, in that he says that if the company are proposing to provide evidence to support police investigations, that should come to the board first. It's the views they are expressing. The new interim chair, it says, noted that if there appeared to be criminal activity, this generally needed to be reported through to the police. and there were issues in some instances of requiring pre-reporting to the board, for example, in relation to suspicions of money laundering. In addition, the chair noted that the proposed process would allow investigations to be conducted by the police rather than the company. And a further action is raised. The chair requested that you, is that correct, RS?
Yes.
Circulate the paper that was provided to the board and the minute extract from the meeting of the 31st of October, and that Mr. Bartlett attend the July board meeting to clarify the proposed position. So that's where matters stood at the end of the June board meeting, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Was the matter in fact remitted to the board the following month?
No, it was not.
Can we please look at a paper which was prepared for consideration by the Strategic Executive Group at its meeting in late June 2024? It is poll 00448345. Did this report come to you in your capacity as company secretary ahead of the meeting of the Strategic Executive Group in late June?
It may have. It may have.
Do you recall reading the report at or around the time it was produced?
Not at the time it was produced, no.
When did you first read it?
When it was disclosed to me the last few days.
So we can see the title of the report is The Passing of Material to Law Enforcement. The report is intended for a meeting date of the 26th of June of 2024. And the author of the report, John Bartlett, Director of Assurance and Complex Investigations, under the sponsorship of Sarah Gray, the Interim Group General Counsel. I appreciate that you, I should say at the outset, I recognise you don't have operational responsibility for these matters. My questions are directed at the oversight of this issue, just to be clear. So under the heading Input Sought, it states discussion and approval for board consideration. The approval of the Strategic Executive Group is sought regarding the proposed change in process in governing the passing of information to law enforcement to assist them in criminal investigations and any subsequent prosecutions prior to this matter being discussed at board in July 2024. If we scroll down, please, to the executive summary, it states, the current group investigations policy, cooperation and law enforcement policy, known as the CLEP, and legal playbook, collectively the old policies, are considered to be too unwieldy and unnecessarily complex, as well as being drafted before the existence of the assurance and complex investigations. The CLEP has resulted in slower than needed provision of information to law enforcement and the unnecessary involvement of the board in the authorisation process. Just pausing there, what was your view at the time as to the appropriateness of the board's involvement to date in the approval of provision of information to the police?
I think the view of the board at probably the point in time, the October 2023 meeting, was that they still wished to see all cases where the provision of evidence to the police were proposed before that evidence was passed on.
You've answered with reference to the view of the board. What I'd like to know is, in your capacity as company secretary and from a governance perspective, what is your view as to the necessity or otherwise of the board to be giving its express approval to the provision of information to the police by an executive arm of the Post Office?
I think it's something that, given our history and where we've been, that it is that significant that for the time being it would seem appropriate to still, in I think the majority of cases, still come to the board.
Forgive me, so you consider that it was appropriate for the matter still to come to the board?
Yes.
Is that correct? So what the executive summary says is this: the old policies have been consolidated into a draft single investigation and cooperation with law enforcement policy. The draft new policy, amongst other investigative operational policy changes, proposes a streamlining of the governance of providing law enforcement with information. The Director of Assurance and Complex Investigations and the in-house criminal counsel would have to agree to providing the information, and depending on the age of the information, a caveat would also be provided. So what's been proposed, in essence, is a relaxation of that previous criteria, which required board approval, and a delegation of that decision to both the Director of Assurance and Complex Investigations and in-house criminal counsel. Is that right?
Yes.
The report goes on to provide some context to this request. At paragraph 21, it refers to the current policy and states this policy was drafted at a time when Post Office did not have an experienced investigative function and had not carried out complex investigations for several years. In February 2022, the Central Investigations Unit, now Assurance and Complex Investigations, started to be formed. Experienced professional investigators were recruited, and operational practices began to go through a test and learn process. Consistent with your evidence, in effect, that CIU had been established or was in the process of being established at or around the time of your appointment as company secretary. At paragraph 2, it says this: the investigations policy was implemented in respect of possible criminal matters relied upon its interactions with the CLEP and legal policy book. These were focused on limiting, in a high-risk perception environment, how Post Office reported matters to and shared data with law enforcement. And now that reference to high-risk perception environment, you've said elsewhere in your statement that you consider that there is an issue within the Post Office in relation to there being a fear of decision-making, a fear of being held accountable for decision-making, and that is contributing to some of the governance issues in relation to what the board's required to deal with. Is that right?
Yes.
This appears to reflect a perception that needs to change. Is that fair?
Yes.
And that the previous policy was reflective of perhaps an excessive concern about the governance of this issue. Is that
Yes.
your reading of? So it goes on to say at paragraph 3, Assurance and Complex Investigations has taken over responsibility for being the only conduit for witness statements to be provided to police, including relieving the security team of this activity. It then states this has given the unit the first pan-poll picture of the scale of these requests and what is required to service them objectively and in an evidence-based way. There are currently 22 police forces requesting or awaiting horizon-based evidence across 33 police investigations. To provide this information, Assurance and Complex Investigations will need to draw on horizon data and often provide transaction analysis. The current approach is that board will need to be approached in the majority of these matters as and when the data is able to be shared. So the concern here appears to be that the policy, which requires prior approval of the board, has created something of a bottleneck in the process of providing information to the police. Is that consistent with your understanding?
I mean, the board meets periodically, and the board can also take decisions by way of written resolution or can call an ad hoc board meeting if required. So I don't think that I agree with a potential bottleneck issue. You know, if the board needs to take a decision quickly and be nimble, they can do it.
This is seeking a more streamlined process that would avoid that oversight and scrutiny by the board.
Yes.
At paragraph 4, it says, it refers to a draft policy attached, which was a proposed replacement of the existing policy, which it said would reflect the enhanced capabilities of assurance and complex investigations and the improved governance approach to investigations generally. What do you understand to be the basis of the insertion that there's an improved governance approach to investigations?
Well, perhaps it is the point around speed of decision making. You know, but as I've just said, I think when the board needs to be nimble, they can be.
This appears to be a reference to the governance of the investigations themselves. Is that internal governance, do you think, or board oversight that's being referenced here? I'm conscious you're not the author of the report, so if you don't know, then you can simply say so.
I'm not sure, to be honest.
It then contains an extract from the new proposed policy, and that's in relation to section 9, entitled Categories of Data, Material and Evidence. It states this: proactively and reactively supplied information will have differing profiles due to historic technology issues. The version of Horizon that was considered at fault in the Horizon IT scandal was replaced in October 2019. In 2022, known errors and bugs identified in the Horizon issues judgment form part of a review by KPMG of the system found to not to be prevalent in the system. From 2021, a new and collaborative approach was taken to resolving reported issues in a dispute resolution process. Due to the effect of these developments, the following approach to data sharing with law enforcement agencies is, and then it sets out the policy. Before we go there, that first paragraph identifies 3 factors which are said to justify the proposed change in approach to oversight of this issue. The first being the adoption of a new version of Horizon in 2019, which we know is HNGA. The second, a review by KPMG, which reportedly concluded that known bugs and errors were not prevalent in the current version of the system. And thirdly, the establishment in 2021 of a new collaborative approach to the resolution of Horizon issues. Now, 2 of those matters predate your appointment as company secretary, but I'd like to ask you about the third one, and that relates to this more collaborative approach to investigating shortfalls. Why do you think it is that the adoption of that more collaborative approach is then seen to justify a change in the oversight arrangements for the provision of evidence to the police?
I'm not sure.
Do you think that that's right, that that new approach being taken to resolving Horizon issues with postmasters in this context justified a relaxation of the board's oversight?
No, I don't think so. I think the board were very clear in October 2023 as to their expectations in respect of the policy.
So going on then, please, to what the new policy would provide, that is to say what the proposal was. It states at paragraph 2, it is the policy that any information originating from Horizon after the 1st of January 2022 may be passed as either intelligence or evidence to law enforcement authorities or agents only after the Director of Assurance and Criminal and Complex Investigations, or their nominated deputy, and an in-house criminal lawyer both give approval. So consistent with what we were saying about the delegation of authority to those two individuals. And it states a record of both their rationales and decision must be recorded on the relevant case file. Where information is requested by law enforcement authorities, that is Horizon data originating from pre-January 2022, the same process must be followed. In addition, the wording included in the relevant section of the investigator's manual covering the passing of information must be included in any witness statement for evidence or in an accompanying email or letter, requesting the information in a non-evidential format. So the policy envisages drawing a line as at January 2022, and in effect treating evidence that post-dates January 2022 essentially as being capable of being relied upon without caveat, and data predating January 2022 as not qualifying in that sense. Is that your reading of this proposal?
Yes.
Do you know why it is that that date was chosen as a point at which it could be said confidently that Horizon data could be relied upon in support of police investigations?
No, I don't.
If we could go on, please, to the... if we could scroll down, please, to page 3. So it says this: there are significant differences between the environment that existed at the time the old policies were formed and the current and future environment. The current approach to dispute resolution and the underlying technology could be seen as supporting a more BAU, is that business as usual?
Yes.
Approach to passing information to law enforcement. However, the most significant difference between 2019, when the old policies were first drafted, and now is that assurance and complex investigations exists and brings significant criminal investigation experience to bear, but more importantly, also considerably more objective rigour to assessing evidence. Project Panther, within assurance and complex investigations, is solely focused on testing the reliability of data that Post Office investigators and law enforcement will rely upon. And then at paragraph 8, a further check and balance to the material provided to law enforcement, which enables a more proportionate governance of this, is that law enforcement agencies do not just take Post Office's word that evidence is reliable. POL can only provide the information to law enforcement. It is for them to decide its admissibility and weight. Given this reality, it is our view that a more agile and devolved, albeit to senior staff with significant relevant experience outside of Post Office, approach may be taken to better serve law enforcement postmasters and the Post Office. That explains then both the context and the justification put forward to the strategic executive group for this proposed change in policy. Is that fair?
Yes.
That group was asked to discuss the approach in advance of the proposal to remit the matter to the board in July. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Now, I don't think you were in attendance at the meeting of the strategic executive group in late June. Is that right?
That's right.
That was attended by your deputy. Did she report back to you on the outcome of that meeting?
I don't recall specifically. We probably would have had a general discussion.
Were you aware that the group had declined to approve the submission of the paper to the board?
I think I was aware of it on the basis that I had this as a matter on the draft agenda for the July board meeting, and it came off that draft agenda. So I think that I deduced that the matter hadn't cleared the executive.
Were you aware that the reason why the executive had refused to approve the paper was that it believed that further assurance was required in relation to Horizon data?
No, I don't think I knew the reasoning.
Has this matter come back to the board since June 2024, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Does it remain the case that board approval is required before any witness evidence about Horizon data is supplied to the police?
Well, yes, in line with the current policy.
I think you said that you consider that that is an appropriate safeguard owing to the history of Horizon prosecutions and the ongoing questions, I suppose, about Horizon's integrity. Is that fair?
Yes.
Thank you. I have one final topic I'd like to discuss with you, Ms.
Before that, Ms. Hodge,
Yes.
this may be me being unduly legalistic, all right? But I just like to get a point clear in my head. Before the police become involved in any suspected crime of the type we are now talking about, a financial crime related to an organization, there has in effect to be a report of an alleged crime to the police. Yeah?
Yes.
So to use, just by way of an example, the suspicion that a postmaster has stolen post office money, before that gets to the police, someone must have formed the suspicion that the postmaster has done that. Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Right. Am I right in thinking that before a report to the police is made about that notional postmaster, the board has to approve it?
Yes, that's right.
That's under the existing policy.
Under the
right?
existing policy, yes.
So essentially what that means, as I would think, as both a citizen and a lawyer, is that the board has satisfied itself that there is sufficient evidential basis to justify a report to the police. Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Right. That I follow entirely. What I'm struggling more with is the next step. The police now begin to investigate. Yeah?
Yes.
And in their investigation, they ask for various witness statements or information or intelligence, whatever you want to call it, in order to further their investigation so that they can decide whether or not a charge is justified. Yeah?
Yes, sir.
What's the need for the board to authorize that? Because the request for this information is coming from the police. What's wrong with just complying with their request? So far as you know, I'm not asking you to be the arbiter of all this. I just want to understand what's behind all these various procedures, if you see what I mean.
I mean, I think it's just given sort of historical sensitivities that the board has wished to stay very close to these matters.
But in the real world, are you saying that there could be instances where a police force would say, right, we'd now like you to provide X, Y, and Z to further our investigations, but the post office would then say no?
I mean, I can't envisage that happening, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so that's why I'm asking why there is the need for, as I might see it, let's say, an excessive degree of caution over this once the police, and I stress that, once the police are the persons asking for the information.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I can say much further, as, you know, just that the board...
Because of the past and people are being very cautious. That's what it boils down to, is it?
Yes, in my view, yes. Yes, sir.
Oh. Yeah. Sorry, Ms. Hodge.
No. Thank you, sir. Ms. Scarrabelotti, my final topic concerns your involvement in the events which culminated in the removal of Mr. Staunton as chair of the Post Office earlier this year. The first issue concerns Mr. Staunton's annual performance appraisal.
Yes,
That was due to take place in January 2024, is that right?
that's right, yes.
And that was 1 year after he'd taken up the role, or approximately 1 year after he'd taken up the role of chair of the Post Office Board.
Yes, that's right.
You say in your statement that you had prepared the necessary documents to support that process, is that right?
That's right.
And you've been liaising with the senior independent director, Mr. Tidswell, and the team at UKGI, including the shareholder non-executive director.
That's right, yes.
You explained that UKGI had requested that the appraisal proceed.
Yes.
Why was it that their view as to whether it ought to proceed was canvassed at that stage?
So I had been working with the UKGI shareholder team on the materials for Henry's appraisal, probably for a good few weeks ahead of actually the proposed appraisal to take place. I think as shareholder, obviously Henry was accountable ultimately to the shareholder, so it was very important to be sure that they were happy with the materials, and also to the timing, and just we're happy for the process to be initiated.
So more a procedural than a substantive matter, is that fair? In terms of seeking their...
Yes, certainly. Just a sort of an informal, courteous... Yes.
You say that you were preparing to issue the relevant documents to the directors of the Post Office Board when Mr. Staunton instructed you to stop the appraisal process, is that right?
That's right, yes.
What was the reason which he gave you for that instruction?
Just given the other pressures that the business was going through at that particular time, so I was asked to pause for the present.
Did you consider that there was any merit in that suggestion, that the pressures that the business was facing warranted pausing the appraisal process?
I mean, January 2024 was a very turbulent time for the business, but we're all subject to periodic performance reviews, and even though the business was in a difficult state and a difficult time, January 2024, I don't think that there was any, I don't think that would be alleviated, by waiting a few months.
Does it follow that you didn't think that was an appropriate instruction for him to give you?
No, it didn't. And like I say, everyone has to go through a performance appraisal, and I can't defer mine. No one can defer theirs. So I didn't think it was appropriate.
What did you do on receiving that instruction?
I went to the senior independent director and shared my concern.
The second issue I'd like to explore with you concerns the decision to appoint Mr. Tidswell's replacement as senior independent director. You explain in your statement that the appointment of the senior independent director is a matter for the board under the 2018 UK Corporate Governance Code.
Yes, that's right.
And you explained that the matter arose first in August 2013 when Mr. Tidswell announced his intention to step down at the end of his current term.
Yes, so 2023.
Forgive me, 2023. Sorry, I
Yes.
said 2018 again, didn't I? 2023, I apologise. As a result of Mr. Tidswell giving that indication to the chair, he requested that the matter of his, the subject matter of his replacement be placed on the agendas of the nominations committee and the poll board in September of that year. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
You say that following those meetings of both the nominations committee and the poll board, that meetings were arranged in October with each of the post office directors which were attended both by you and by Mr. Staunton. Is that right?
So it wasn't all of the post office directors.
Sorry, forgive me, the board directors.
Yes, so, but not all of the post office board directors.
Yeah.
Meetings were not held with all of those. So obviously Al Cameron was out of the business, unwell, and then Ben Tidswell, there wasn't a consultation meeting held with him either.
Because he was leaving.
Because he was leaving.
And it was his
yes.
Can you please explain what was the purpose of those individual meetings with the other directors of the board?
To get the directors' views on whether or not the incoming SID should be drawn from the existing board membership, so be an internal appointment, or whether that appointment should be made externally. And if the appointment was made externally, what were the key skills and attributes and the technical expertise for that external recruit?
Now, you say that the shareholder had expressed a strong view or a strong preference for both an external appointment and a candidate who had Whitehall experience. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And you also explained that there was a division within the board as to whether the appointment of those whose views were canvassed, there was a division as to whether the appointment ought to be internal or external. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And that Mr. Staunton determined, in view of that division, to give preference to the shareholders' view and to seek the appointment of an external candidate. Is that right?
That's right.
I think you say that you sent an email on the 25th of October to advise the other board members of that decision.
That's right, yes.
Now, that resulted in the matter going to the nominations committee in November. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And they gave their approval to the initiation of a recruitment process. Is that correct?
That's right, yes. Well, they approve a recommendation being made to the shareholder for the recruitment process.
For the recruitment to commence. Now, on the 17th of January of this year, you've explained in your statement that the Chair, Mr. Staunton, emailed certain of the poll post office board members to advise that there had been a change of sentiment amongst the board about the decision to make an external appointment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you know from where Mrs. Staunton had obtained that impression?
I mean, I don't really know. So I guess, sort of as I mentioned before, January, this year was a tough month for the company. A lot was going on. So, yeah, I imagine that the directors may have fed back to Mr. Staunton that to appoint internally for the SID was preferable as opposed to recruiting externally, given the circumstances at the time.
You note in your statement that the shareholder non-executive director wasn't copied in to the email sent by Mr. Staunton on the 17th of January, notifying the other board members of this proposed change in approach. Do you know why it is that was the case?
Potentially because the shareholder non-executive director had a different view as to the approach.
Did you read this as an attempt by Mr. Staunton to sideline the shareholder non-executive director?
Well, I think that's what it was, yes.
On the 18th of January, so the following day, you say that the chair asked you to review your notes of the individual meetings which you had attended between the chair and those directors whose views were canvassed about the question of an appointment. So that was back in October of the previous year.
Yes.
Is that right? And he asked you to advise as to what their preferences had been as to who on the board should take up the role of the senior independent director in the event of an internal appointment. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And you duly sent your record of that meeting, or a summary of the views that were canvassed at that meeting to the chair. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
Mr. Staunton then, on the 20th of January, so 2 days later, emailed the board to notify the members that an internal appointment had been made. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
You say that he then went on to instruct you to halt the recruitment process for an external candidate.
Yes.
And that you felt unable to follow that instruction, you say, because the requisite governance procedures had not been followed and the approach was not in line with the existing mandate from the shareholder. Is that right?
That's right.
When it came to Mr. Staunton's attention that there had been a change of sentiment amongst the members of the board, what processes do you think he should have followed to ensure that that matter was dealt with appropriately?
Well, I think that we would have needed to have a formal board meeting to take all the views of all the board members and then a formal vote on the matter in order to change the previous decision that had been taken.
So it was the nature of your concern that the matter hadn't been properly canvassed at board level, rather than, for example, being remitted to the nominations committee?
No, my concern wasn't that the matter hadn't been that there hadn't been adequate consultation. My concern was that there hadn't been, that the decision hadn't taken place in the appropriate forum at board. So it's a decision for board, the appointment of the senior independent director. All directors need to be given an opportunity to participate in that vote. And from what I understood, not all directors were given that opportunity.
In particular, the shareholder non-executive director?
The shareholder non-executive director. Also, I understand Amanda Burton was not consulted. Neither was Ben Tidswell. And we've said that, Al Cameron was on sick leave at the time. So quite a few members of the board not given the opportunity to vote on this matter.
You say that so you had two concerns, essentially. One related to the following of due process
Yes.
in reaching that decision. And the other concern you identify in your statement was that the decision wasn't consistent with the existing mandate from the shareholder.
That's right.
Does this episode reflect, do you think, a tension in the governance of the post office between the matters which are properly reserved to the board and the involvement of the shareholder and the influence of the shareholder in those decisions?
I don't think so. I mean, the shareholder was very clear in providing their view. However, I think if the board had taken an alternative view, that would have been, to originally appoint an internal candidate, I think that would have stood.
Thank you. I've no further questions. If you remain there, there may be some questions from the recognised legal representatives of some of the core participants.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I appear for a large number of core participants, sub-postmasters, former sub-postmasters and assistants who are represented by Howe & Co. Ms. Scarrabelotti, I have a few questions to ask you. Firstly, about what you say in your statement about culture. At 11:45 this morning, Ms. Hodge said that you'd made reference in your statement to an issue within a post office of decision-making, of a fear of decision-making, of being held accountable. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Could we very quickly go to where you deal with that in your statement? It's WITN 111-20600, paragraph 33G, page 19 of 85. And while we're waiting for that to come up, you're giving your reflections here as to the adequacy and effectiveness of Post Office's current corporate governance arrangements. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Do we see that? Yes, it's on the screen now. So at G, as highlighted elsewhere in my statement, current poll employees are acutely aware of the failings of the past. This appears to have caused an apparent reluctance to take decisions for fear of getting it wrong, and therefore being liable to future criticism. Is that right?
Yes.
And you go on to say this reluctance in turn results in decisions either stagnating or being pushed to more senior decision-making forums. Ultimately, more poll board time is taken up with matters of less strategic importance, and there is diminished accountability on the part of less senior forums and individuals. Now I have some questions to ask you about that. Firstly, what decisions are being stagnated as a result of this fear of accountability or paralysis that's affecting the board?
I mean, it could be sort of any decision across the business. To be honest, yeah. I don't think I can give you a particular category or business unit.
And when you say that decisions of greater strategic importance are being pushed to more senior decision-making forums, what are those forums and what are the decisions of greater strategic importance?
So I say matters of less strategic importance in my witness statement, sorry.
Okay. Our clients are concerned about the delays in the provision of redress to sub-postmasters. Have these delays been affected by the paralysis in decision-making in the post office as a result of the scandal?
Potentially, yes.
And can you elaborate on that at all?
I think that there's sort of just general nervousness around decision-making. So, that it will take a long time perhaps for a proposal to crystallise, that there's more agonising over recommendations, perhaps in other businesses that I've worked at, and that overall that leads to slower decision making.
I've been asked to ask if you can move a little bit closer to your microphone.
Sorry, pardon me. Yeah.
And what do you think can be done to free up this paralysis, this fear of making decisions in reasonable time?
I think it's empowering people, and I think it's looking at decision making from board level down. So the board currently has delegated authority to the executive for £5 million, but looking at whether or not that delegation needs to be increased. Also, ultimately looking at the board and their relationship with the shareholder and whether or not certain decisions that go to the shareholder can perhaps come back to the board. And I think making those sorts of changes could increase from the top down confidence in decision making.
Do you think having more sub-postmaster representation on the board, something that you say would be a good thing, would assist in enabling more speedy and effective decision making?
Potentially on the board, but I think it could be more effective in other layers. So perhaps looking at the executive structure, where we have the Postmaster Experience Director sit as part of the wider leadership team, thinking, do we need more people with that title or similar titles at the leadership level, at the executive level.
Do you think the government should play a more direct role in order to resolve this fear of decision making?
But potentially to have a look at at our articles and the contractual arrangements between the shareholder and the company, and looking at opportunities to empower the company to take more decisions. Yes.
And how would that work? How would the shareholder be brought in to assist with decision making?
Well, the shareholder would actually be removed from certain decision making and allow the company enhanced decision making in some respects.
Yeah, as I understand you, you're saying, in effect, that the government is too involved in some decision making, and that should be handed over to the Paul board.
Yes, sir, that's right.
Yeah, your question. So that leads me on to my next question. Is this fear a fear of the Department of Business, that it's the government, the shareholder, that will criticise the decisions? Or is it more public opinion?
I think more public opinion and just fear of getting it wrong, given the catastrophes of the past.
You've said in your statement that having at least one board member who is legally qualified is vitally important.
In my view, yes.
And you say that Ms Burton has legal experience, and that has been helpful in challenging what the executive are telling the board. Do you think that if the board had its own legal counsel or equivalent, a standing lawyer, that would cut through nervousness about what the board is being told by the executive?
So obviously we have a general counsel who is not a member of the executive but is a standing attendee and invitee to executive meetings. In-house counsel carries the same independence obligations as you would expect. The interim general counsel too is attending board meetings to provide independent advice. So I think that's sort of an enhancement, for the board.
So your evidence is that having board members who are also legally qualified is what you think there should be more of?
No, I don't think necessarily more of, but I think having one of is very valuable.
And you go on to say that having a board member with IT technology experience is imperative.
Well, absolutely, because we're embarking on a major technology transformation.
And are there directors with that experience on the board yet?
Not currently, no.
And what steps are there proposed?
So we're currently recruiting for a independent non-executive director with a skill set in technology and cyber.
I want to ask you finally about the meetings with sub-postmasters that you've referred to at paragraph 45A of your statement. No need to put it up. But you say that you're aware of the meetings that have taken place between sub-postmasters and directors.
Sorry, let me just go to it.
45A of the statement.
It's page 31.
Thank you, sir.
So,
in order to demonstrate a desire
yes.
for cultural change.
So these are meetings between postmasters and members of the executive as opposed to board directors.
Right. Are you aware of those meetings? Have you discussed those meetings with the members of the executive who've held those meetings with?
They've been spoken about, absolutely, at times when I have sat with the board and when I have sat in the executive forum as well.
We understand that on the 23rd of June 2023, Nick Reed had a meeting with 100 senior officials and leaders in the post office to discuss the meetings that he'd held with sub-postmasters, and he said that this was part of his determination to change culture within the post office. Did you attend that meeting or any such meetings to discuss the experiences from these meetings?
I mean, I don't recall if I attended that meeting. It's probably highly likely that I did.
Can you confirm whether what's happened in those meetings, the information that's been provided by sub-postmasters to members of the executive, how that is being used to feed into the post office culture?
I think that the executives who participate in those meetings are very, very deeply moved and find that those meetings very, very challenging, very difficult, very confronting, but I think they come back into the business with a real sense to enact change.
On Wednesday, Mr. Brocklesby gave evidence, and he has attended some of these meetings with sub-postmasters, and we know that he's leaving post office, and we know that the current chief executive is leaving post office as well. What steps are being taken to ensure that corporate memory is maintained despite the high turnover and of executives and board members in recent years?
Well, Mr. Reid is staying for a number of months yet, so there will be, I imagine, a handover period. At board level, it has been difficult, obviously, to retain corporate memory with the number of step downs that we've had in the last few years. But we do try as much as we can to have handover periods, to have handover notes, to have full induction, packs and meetings.
Well, are the lessons from the meetings with sub-postmasters being recorded? Are they being transmitted throughout the business, or are they just experiences that executives have for their own knowledge and their own purposes?
I do think that they are transmitted through the business, and they are.
How are they transmitted?
Well, they're spoken about, as I say, at board meetings, at executive meetings. I think Mr. Reid, in different updates, CEO updates to the board, has reflected on his experiences of those meetings. I think at different meetings of the senior leadership team, as it was previously called, those meetings had been touched on, and the nature of those meetings, the tone of those meetings. So absolutely, I think those meetings are brought back into the business.
And are you aware of any wider restorative justice initiatives that have been proposed, such as, for example, ongoing psychiatric and counselling support for sub-postmasters and their families, ways of helping the children whose education was disrupted by the scandal, educational bursaries, initiatives to restore reputations of sub-postmasters in their local communities and areas? Has that been discussed at board level?
I'm pretty sure at board level, yes. So in enhanced restorative justice measures being discussed along with looking at the funding for that.
And is that something that Post Office is actively considering?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
I'll just see if I have any more questions.
No.
I don't have any more questions for you.
Thank you.
Grateful, thank you.
So I think that concludes the questions from the representatives of core participants.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Scarrabelotti, for making a total of 5 detailed witness statements. I think we can say that the corrective statement wouldn't have taken you all that long, but the others must have taken a great deal of time. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for coming to give oral evidence before me this morning.
Thank you, sir.
Where do we go now, Ms. Hodge? Do we take an early lunch or do we start the next witness?
So my proposal would be that we resume at 1:45 after an early lunch.
Yeah, fine.